survivors are in the room. I think we have some images we can show. There's about 10 of them, we believe, who are there. You see them here. They are wearing matching shirts. We have interviewed some of them. We will be interviewing more of them coming up later tonight here on NBC News. They are encouraging senators on this committee to vote against Blanche's nomination because of the concerns they have with the release of the Epstein documents, material that was unredacted, Blanche's conversation with Ghislaine Maxwell. And Kelly, while Blanche again acknowledged that, there were errors in redaction, et cetera, he still defended what the DOJ has done. And there was an interesting exchange with Senator Durbin where he talked about how he says he couldn't meet directly with survivors, but attorneys could, and that the DOJ would be happy to do that.
We saw repeatedly how Todd Blanche wanted to put some distance between himself in this role and at this time of his confirmation hearing and getting in the room with survivors who could tell their stories. And part of what he was suggesting is that as the top law enforcement officer, it would not be appropriate for him to do that if there are ongoing investigations and those kinds of things. However, certainly Senator Durbin and those who advocate on behalf of those survivors believe it is an important signal for the acting attorney general who seeks the job permanently to show more deference to these survivors and willingness to hear their stories and to see what more can be done. Of course, we know some of the stories include very personal, very upsetting experiences that they have had that are in some ways borne out in the files, but there may be other information that they can bring forward. And certainly they know some of the names of the prominent people who have been associated with Jeffrey Epstein, whom those survivors group talk about in their own personal terms. So Todd Blanche was very much trying to keep some distance. He did agree to try to, as early as today, bring about some kind of connection between that survivors group and his department. But that will likely be unsatisfying to those survivors who, by their presence, by their willingness to go forward in a public way to talk about very difficult things that happened in their lives when they were young women, that there has been a broad public understanding of this needing to have more sunlight on the issues, more concern for the fact that there has not been prosecution of those who perpetrated these acts against young women, and the frustration that still exists. That has to some degree been bipartisan, but clearly the White House has wanted to move past the Epstein matter. The president has repeatedly been frustrated when he's asked questions about it in the months gone by. He did ultimately sign the law that required the disclosure, but that was something where the president was really boxed into a corner with members of his own party. You can recall the time when Marjorie Taylor Greene had been a fierce supporter of the president, put her own political future on the line, in large part because of this issue. She's now out of Congress. So it has been a rocky road for the survivors, and it has certainly been a consequential path when you consider the politics, the legal issues, and the remaining questions about the Epstein case, the files, the history of it all. And in Todd Blanche's direct conduct, his meeting with Ghislaine Maxwell is something where he says that was an opportunity to learn more information directly from her, but he has not sat down in the same way with survivors. And while he can talk about some of the legal practices associated with that, there may be a willingness of these survivors to push for more on that. We certainly saw Senator Durbin, the Democrat of Illinois, trying to push for more on that. One of the things in tone and tenor that we see today is that Todd Blanche is very aware this is an audition. This is a job interview. So he has not been combative. He's held his ground at times. He has tried to distance himself or take issue with questions. But it has not been the kind of sparring we've seen in other cases where administration officials have come before committees, not at confirmation time, but when they're actively on the job. So definitely a tone here of being very much aware that Todd Blanche knows that his path to get the job permanently has to go through this committee.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.